Hi, everyone. I think we're going to begin. My name is Paula Eiselt, and I'll be moderating this really interesting session that will be informal and hopefully conversational. It is called My Body, Whose Decision? Abortion Advocacy in a Time of Rising Antisemitism. As reproductive rights face increasing threats across the United States, Jewish advocates are confronting a dual challenge: the erosion of abortion access and the rise of anti-Semitism, both of which target our moral agency, religious freedom, and communal safety. So, we find ourselves in a very difficult moment in time as Jewish people, as women, men who care about reproductive rights, and all human beings should. And so today, we're here with amazing people that can speak to this crossroads that we're at and give insight into this moment in time, what we can do and what we're up against. So first is Dr. Noam Stadlan. He is a vice chairman of the Department of Neurosurgery at Endeavor Health and assistant professor of neurosurgery at the Pritzker School of Medicine and University of Chicago. And he is going to talk about the halachic standpoint on abortion and also the stigma within the Orthodox community. Where does, the Orthodox community, stand on this, and how we can work to open up this conversation about abortion access within our communities. And then over here is Darcy Hirsh. Darcy Hirsh is Vice President of Government Relations and Advocacy at the National Council for Jewish Women, where she fights for equity and justice for women, children, and families. Darcy is an advocate and coalition builder who has dedicated her career to engaging the Jewish community in pursuit of justice and equity for all. She's worked in many organizations and government positions, including the EJA, the ADL, and many others. And really, NCJW has been such a leader in the space on reproductive rights, especially as these rights have eroded across the country. So thank you. And next to me is Tombros, who is also a hero. She brings 2 decades of nonprofit leadership in reproductive health and rights and organizational strategy to her role as founder of the Red Tent Fund. As founding executive director of Culture of Respect, she led a groundbreaking national initiative to end campus sexual violence. She later served as Senior Operations and Strategy Director at the DC Abortion Fund until resigning in 2023 in response to anti-Semitic conduct by staff and board. So she's going to talk with us all about that. Before we get to our amazing panelists, I just want to introduce myself a bit. Like I said, my name is Paula Eiselt. I'm a filmmaker, so I wear like a different hat than the amazing healthcare providers and policy experts here, but a lot of my filmmaking has been rooted in women's empowerment and reproductive health and justice. From the first film I did is called 93 Queen, about a group of Hasidic women who start as Ras Nashim. Some of you might know it. It was the first all-female ambulance corps in the U.S., and that was really about women, wanting to both serve and, in that community and be served by women, because Hatzalah does not allow women to serve. So that's about healthcare and also like culturally congruent care, which is more important now than ever with rising anti-Semitism. I also made a film called Aftershock about the U.S. maternal health crisis. And that film is about our abysmal record in maternal health and the racial disparities that help, unfortunately, drive that poor record. Women die here in childbirth more than any other Western country in the world, and our maternal health care system needs a lot of work. So there's that film, and then it connects to a short I did called Under God, which is directly about what we're talking about, the post-Dobb space we are in, and it follows a few people, but the inciting incident is this Rabbi Barry Silver, Zichron Lebracha, who happened to have passed away, unfortunately, a couple years ago. He sued the state of Florida based on religious freedom and started a whole slew of lawsuits that said that, not having abortion rights is an infringement on religious freedom for Jews, for Muslims, and for even Christians, too. So that's, where I find myself in this space. And I mention the films not just to tell you who I am, but I think they represent, there's a piece of them that speak to this moment. There's the culturally congruent care that we need in this moment of anti-Semitism. Having a healthcare provider who understands you is more important than ever. Maternal health and abortion care are one conversation. We usually bifurcate them. We think of like abortion here and pregnancy here, and that somehow they're at odds with each other. But really, a lot of the healthcare overlaps, and we need to talk about those things together. So with that, maybe, Noam, if you don't mind starting and expanding on that.
Thank you. So Rabbi Daphne Lazar-Price asked me, she gave me the task of summarizing the Orthodox view of abortion. Thousands of years, thousands of pages in 5 to 7 minutes. So here we go. If we're talking about abortion within the Orthodox community, essentially everyone agrees that abortion is mandated when the mother's life is at risk. And everyone agrees that abortion should not be done for less than serious reasons. And between that, there's a large number of cases where the mother, either her physical or mental health is at risk, and that's usually due to cases of mamzerut or rape or probably a growing number of fetal defects. And so we have a wide diversity of opinions about what halacha says in those situations. And they're characterized by a debate between Rav Moshe Feinstein, who was in the United States, and Rav Eliezer Waldenberg, who was in Israel. And their positions, when you read them, they give different rationales for the prohibition of abortion. So Rav Moshe says that abortion is essentially murder without the penalty, but it is murder. And Rav Waldenberg shows that it comes under the category of chavala, or injury to the mother. It also might come under wasting of seed, but it's not murder. And each posek comes to those conclusions, and if you read them, there's a specific halachic answer and a specific halachic methodology. But what you don't see is that there's other factors underneath. So for example, while Waldenberg was at Shaare Zedek Hospital, he saw all the women with their children with birth defects. In his tshuva, he writes very emotionally about the suffering of mothers with deformed children, and you see that he understands that. And Rav Moshe actually doesn't even mention suffering of women in some of his tshuvot. And what that points out is that the decisions about abortion, we usually talk about somebody being mekil or machmir. So we think usually machmir, that's good to be machmir every once in a while. But what that forgets about is it's not just the fetus that we have to be mekil or machmir about, it's the mother that we have to be mekil or machmir about. And when you see a tshuva for Rav Moshe, and I have great admiration and respect and love for Rav Moshe, but he doesn't mention the mother. That doesn't come into his calculation. And so what we see from that is that these tshuvot, especially Rav Moshe in the late 60s, early 70s, there was a big culture war in the United States about abortion. And although he doesn't mention Christianity specifically, a similar tshuva, Rav Moshe Zweig in Antwerp, wrote about prohibiting abortion for children with thalidomide-induced abnormalities. And he specifically wrote, "We cannot have the divine name profaned by a lenient ruling when the church has unequivocally expressed its opposition to killing the fetus in this context." And so you almost never see the church mentioned in a tshuva. We don't usually paskin by them. But you can see how much the milieu affected these decisions. And what that translates to the current situation is that we have increasing patriarchy, we have Christian dominionism, we have this milieu of just oppression, and the parts of our community that find that resonant are going to be even more more repressive in their decisions and in their approaches. And we have to understand, I think, three things. One is that the permissive approach of Rav Waldenberg is extraordinarily well-founded and is mainstream in many parts of the Orthodox world, and we should have absolutely no compunction about stating that and showing that those who are being more restrictive are probably being more influenced by outsiders than halacha. That's number one. Number two is that any law that is more restrictive than the most permissive Orthodox position is denying someone their ability to practice Judaism, as your film in Florida. And how can Orthodox Jews want a law that prohibits other Orthodox Jews from practicing Judaism? That just makes no sense. And so I think this is kind of what we're looking at, but it's very important for us to understand that we have an extraordinarily valid and probably the best source position, and that we need to be active in this situation.
Thank you so much for that. Thank you. Darcy, do you want to talk about the work of NCJW and kind of paint a picture of what the policy space is right now, and how does NCJW fit into that as a, of course, Jewish women's organization who, you work across the board with many different organizations fighting for reproductive rights post-October 7th? Like, where have you found yourself and the organization?
Sure, thank you. In 5 minutes, you want me to go? Excuse me. Well, it's really a pleasure to be here today, and thank you for that. I appreciate what you read in my bio, that I really style myself as an advocate who fights for equity and justice on a range of issues on behalf of and with the Jewish community. And so if you're not familiar with National Council of Jewish Women, we are a 133-year-old Jewish feminist civil rights organization fighting for equity and justice for women, children, and families. We have a network of nearly 50 affiliates around the country and 250,000 advocates who we mobilize on issues related to our priorities. We've been involved in fighting for reproductive rights, health, and justice from the get-go. We were actually involved in the fight to establish birth control clinics in America in the 1920s, which led to the development of Planned Parenthood. So, we've really been in this fight from day one. And, as you've said, with the increasing restrictions following the Dobbs ruling, have been the leading voice in the Jewish community on policy related to reproductive rights, both on the national level and on the state level. We've been fighting to push abortion ballot measures around the country. We're fighting on Capitol Hill for a federal right to abortion access. We fight against restrictions on reproductive health access in federal law and around the country. And key to this work is our work in coalition and broad-based coalitions. One of the things that brought me to NCJW, I've been here for almost 2 years after a variety of Jewish organizational work, as you cited, was the broad-based coalitions that we work together in to accomplish all of our priorities, whether it's fighting for democracy, fighting for immigrants, fighting for justice against discrimination, and fighting against anti-Semitism. And it's because of our relationships in those coalitions that we're able to move our shared priorities forward. I will say that following October 7th, obviously was devastating for all of the reasons that we've all been devastated. And additionally, because a lot of the relationships that we had in those coalitions were kind of laid bare to see what are those relationships, what do those mean, how do we continue to do this work? And it was hard. It's still hard, right? People who were friends shared views that were very harmful and hurtful. But coalition work is hard. And now, I am privileged to work at a Jewish organization, and I can say that, we have a long view of how we're going to be able to unite to move our policy priorities forward. I've been working in the economic justice space, working for food insecurity, working for healthcare with a variety of faith and civil rights partners who have very different views than I do of October 7th, who have said things and been at tables that I've been at saying, do we want Zionists at the table? And I've been at those tables, and it's very challenging. And we still continue to sit at those tables because as a Jewish feminist organization, we have a really unique voice. And if we step away, that voice is no longer at the table. And so it's hard. We call people in. We have a lot of individual hard discussions, but it's really important for us to be able to move forward to stay at those tables. And I'll just give an example. Just last week, a colleague of mine was in a meeting, an interfaith meeting, it was a Repro Coalition meeting with Senator Warnock's office. And Senator Warnock was having a really hard time supporting an abortion access bill, and he said, I'm having a lot of trouble with the faith angle on this. And my colleague from NCJW said, well, here's the language. 83% of the Jewish community supports abortion access. We at NCJW, we commemorate Repro Shabbat every year when we read the Parshat Mishpatim. And she talked about the fact that, in our view, religious freedom is reproductive freedom. And his staffer said, thank you, that's really helpful, and that will actually help him support this legislation. And if we're not at those tables, we're not able to make that change.
Thank you. And thank you for staying at those tables, really. Allie, I want to turn to you. I would love for you to talk about the Red Tent Fund and the inception, why it came to be and at what point. And before you do that, I have admired Allie for a long time because I don't know if you know this, we both work in progressive spaces where our Jewishness has made us outsiders. And in very direct relation to what you're doing, a quick little story, when I was releasing Under God, it was right after October 7th. It was November 2023, and I was already working with this impact company, and we planned this. It was a Zoom webinar, and it was interfaith based, and it was marketed and promoted, and it was. I was on it as a filmmaker. Rabbi Dov Linzer was on it. Then there was a Muslim imam, a Muslim lawyer, and two Christian leaders, and it was really kind of this going to be this beautiful program, interfaith, about abortion rights and how using our faith to safeguard those rights. And as one of us, if it was either me or Rabbi Linzer, started speaking, right after that, the Muslim lawyer came on and said, we really can't talk about this unless we're talking about what's happening to the women in Gaza right now. We can't have this conversation. And that was live streamed, and the company had and then the other person on there was yes, thank you for saying that. And it completely derailed the conversation. And obviously, I don't have to tell this room, it was just, that's a different conversation and nothing to do with U.S. abortion policy. But the fact that we were there speaking as Jewish people, that was enough that we had to answer for that. So, I know that you can speak to that, and I would love for you to.
Sure. Thank you. I'm sorry. That sounds that feels like a thing that could have been ironed out before that webinar. Like, hey, what's on the table, what's not? Hi, everybody. My name is Tombros Corman. I am the founder and executive director of the Red Tent Fund, and we are an organization that funds abortion for all meaning any person of any religion, any political affiliation, any identity, you name it. We want to fund abortion, and we do that with funding through the Jewish community. And I think speaking here next to Darcy is really quite perfect because usually when I start the spiel, I say, well, there is no Red Tent Fund without the National Council of Jewish Women, because the National Council of Jewish Women really opened up the door and started the conversation about how can you talk about abortion and not just religion, but abortion and Judaism in the same breath. And yeah, to your point, we found ourselves in very similar spaces. I'm a public health person by training, and I've spent my entire career in sexual and reproductive health. And in 2022, I took a job with the DC Abortion Fund, or DCAF as they are known in the DC area where I live. And like most local abortion funds, they raised money through their community, and they used that money to pay for abortion procedures that are so often not covered by state health insurance, that are financially out of reach for so many people. And was delightedly doing that work because I feel incredibly passionately about abortion work. I've lived in the DC area for 25 years, so here I am helping people living in or traveling into my community to get abortion care, and so it was deeply meaningful. And after October 7th, I think all of our lives, or many of our lives, turned upside down on that day. I certainly did not expect my professional life to kind of take the beating that it did. Almost immediately, I was singled out within the organization. I was the only Jewish staff person, and there was no Jews on the board. And pretty much the entire organization, with the exception of me, to your point, felt like, well, we have to talk about what's happening in Gaza. And my feeling was, no, we don't. We're a local abortion fund. We fund abortion in the DC area. What do we have to add to the conversation that the smartest minds of our generation have not been able to figure out half a world away? But I was outvoted on that, which is fine. But then I stuck my foot out again, and I said, okay, but if we as an organization are going to say things about what is happening to the women of Gaza, how are we not talking about rape used as a weapon of war, hostage taking, murdering? And I just got no's across the board. And the longer and longer this went on, and this went on for weeks, the more entrenched it became. And it really became me on one side trying to speak for all Jewish people as if we're some kind of monolith and as if we agree on really anything, let alone the post-October 7th political climate, and everyone else in the organization on the other side. And I made the decision to resign from my organization. When I called my board chair to tell her that I was stepping down, she didn't pick up the phone, and I left a message tendering my resignation, and she texted me back a couple hours later and said, well, we understand if DCAF is no longer a fit for you, which to me said, you're causing a lot of trouble, get out. So I left, and a couple months later, I wrote about my experience in an online Jewish magazine, and the outpouring of responses I got from people not just in our movement, not just in reproductive health, but in other progressive movements like climate change or immigration justice or food insecurity or what have you, was staggering. Everyone Jewish in a progressive space felt like they were being singled out or othered or being asked to answer for things that we have no control over. And so I made the decision to start the Red Tent Fund so that people who care about domestic abortion funding through a Jewish lens have a place where they can come and do that, where we are not going to ask you about your politics on the Middle East. We are not going to ask you, any type of litmus test question about why you're here. If you are here because you believe in funding abortion in this country and you are aligned with the values that we as Jews bring to this work, we would love to have you in our tent.
Thank you. Thank you for creating that organization. So before we open it up to questions, I want to just pose a question to all of you of, from your personal, from your expertise, from whatever lens you have right now, like what should we all be doing in this moment of time where we are obviously, as we've been talking, really challenged by both anti-Semitism and the lack of abortion rights in the country. And I want to add a third part of that is, because of anti-Semitism, how do we keep this conversation going? Because usually when any minority, any people, any person rather, is fighting for their survival or to preserve their identity, that usually has to be a first priority. And in many of these cases, women's rights are usually the first to go, right? Like, we kind of toss those out. People stop talking about women very quickly. So how do we address this climate of anti-Semitism and eroding rights with making sure that this conversation also is not going to get lost in our communities? So maybe whoever wants to go first, whoever feels ready.
I can get us started and hopefully stop messing up the mic so that I don't damage everyone's hearing. It's a great question. I think, again, not to point to Darcy, but I think you're seeing like two really interesting answers to that question. Darcy and NCJW stayed at the table in coalition with these other organizations, and they had to, for exactly the reasons that you said. Someone has to be at those tables and making our voice heard. And at the same time, I think in the moment, it is completely appropriate for me to walk away and for others to walk away and say, you know what, we're gonna be over here and we're gonna do our thing the way we do it. Not for nothing, we have some historical reason to believe that, we've seen this before, whether it's universities or social clubs or law firms or universities, what have you. We've stepped aside and made our own institutions, and we have made those institutions so incredible, so undeniably important in the work that they do, that they continue to keep the conversation going. And that's what's really important to me, is that we're out here funding abortion because there has never been a more critical time to fund abortion. And two, I don't want us to walk away from the table wholesale and lose this space in the conversation that Jews have been a part of for so long. So I think it's a complementary series of actions. Folks in coalition staying there, folks like Red Tent going out and carving their own path, and hopefully we keep beating the drum so exactly what you said could happen doesn't happen.
Thank you for that great segue. Just to echo Allie, there are different tools for different times and for different organizations and people, and you're part of the conversation in just a different way. And so I think that the overarching takeaway is that we need to be part of the conversation in whatever way feels comfortable for us, whether it's individual relationships, whether it's talking about the issue, whether it's talking about Jewish values and reproductive freedom, whether it's meeting with your lawmaker, it's making a donation to a local abortion fund or the Red Tent Fund or the Jewish Fund for Abortion Access. Like, you have to stay in the conversation. I also just want to share an anecdote, and then I also want to share something that we're working on at NCJW that I think is very timely. On the one-year anniversary of October 7th, a large repro organization released a horrifying statement about the attack. JOFA released a statement. It was the National Network of Abortion Funds. JOFA released a beautiful statement that condemned their statement that was extraordinarily meaningful for many in the Jewish community, and it's really important that JOFA spoke out in that way. NCJW did not, because we are in coalition with that organization. And instead of launching a big public statement, what we did was make sure that there were ground rules around our coalition work, knowing that we were moving forward on domestic policy with that organization. And so we spoke with our partners in that coalition and said, listen, we all need to be on the same page here. We're talking about reproductive health access in the US. We are not talking about what's happening overseas. And we were able to create ground rules to make sure that we were able to work productively in coalition moving forward. So that's just one tactic that I wanted to share, that there are different tools at different times for different organizations and different people. One thing that we're really focused on right now, aside from what I shared earlier, is something called the FACE Act. The FACE Act is a law that was passed a little bit over 30 years ago to protect people seeking reproductive health access at clinics and providers. This was passed in the face of horrific attacks on abortion clinics. Some providers were murdered. There was a deep need for this law to be passed in 1994, and NCJW was part of the coalition to pass this law. This law also protects access to houses of worship, and it's now been used to protect houses of worship that are seeing violent protesters blockading people from accessing their house of worship. You know, I know everybody is aware of what happened at the Park East Synagogue a couple of weeks ago. There was also a protest at a large synagogue in Los Angeles. And what's interesting is that the administration is now using the FACE Act to protect synagogues, and they have stopped using it to protect clinics. And not only stopped using it, but President Trump, as one of his first actions in office, pardoned 23 people who had been convicted of violently obstructing patients and providers from accessing reproductive health clinics. And so one of the things that we're talking about now at NCJW is how do we use our leadership and our unique nexus and understanding of this law. Look, we can use this to protect houses of worship, we can fight against anti-Semitism, and we can also use it to protect people accessing clinics. And both of those ends of the spectrum reflect our Jewish values. So that's one of the things that we're talking about at all of these tables that we bring a unique role in.
Everyone to my left is obviously in the trenches doing important work. I think from a halachic point of view, it's more educating. You're working outside our community and having our community go to in the public spaces. From the halachic point of view, I think it's important to educate within our community that having access to abortion in the cases that it's allowed and sometimes just mandated is important, and to clear up misconceptions and to make sure that we educate as many people in our community as far as what actual halacha is and not what some people are claiming that it is. And then it's also important to emphasize the Religious Freedom Act aspect, that all these restrictive laws are really impinging on our religious freedom and everybody else's religious freedom. So I think halacha has something to say for both of those specific areas.
Thank you. And Noam, while we have you, I just have a follow-up question, a little more generally like in the medical space, which obviously intersects with everything we're talking about. There has been a lot of reports of anti-Semitism to patients, provider to provider. There's a lot of happening in that space, and I wonder if you're seeing that on the ground, and is that translating to patient care? Like, should I know Jewish women in the UK recently reported that they are making sure that everyone has like a Jewish doula coming to the hospitals with them because they don't trust the healthcare system in the UK. So I don't know if you can speak to any of this, but I'm curious what you're seeing.
So that's a great question. I personally practice in an area that's pretty heavily Jewish in the north suburbs of Chicago, and so I see very little of that. I think here in the United States, the vast majority of professional medical staffs are professional, and so even people who have deeply held beliefs are constrained by that. There have been isolated incidents. There was one resident who posted on Facebook that she was going to kill all the Jews, and I think it was in Ohio, and her program booted her out, and I'm not sure if she's found another spot. So there are reports of this sort of conduct. My daughter, who's a resident at Montefiore, notes that some people have watermelon pins and things like that, but it hasn't really manifested as specific acts of harm as far as I can tell, or if they are, they're extremely isolated. So I think here in the United States, it might be a better situation than what's reported in the UK.
Okay, hopefully it stays that way. So I want to open it up to questions. Any questions, comments?
Okay, I guess that one's for me.
Repeat the question on like.
Yes, so the question is, what is permitted or required in the case of abortion? So the most commonly quoted position is Rav Eliezer Waldenberg, and he said great need. And great need is a pretty amorphous concept. And essentially, he was addressing situations where a child had Tay-Sachs and was going to die within a couple of years. He addressed the situation of someone with Down syndrome, and he said that and you have to remember that the treatment and care of patients with Down syndrome is a lot different now than it was in the 1970s. The expectations are different, but at that point in time, he allowed for abortion in the 7th month for a child if they knew it was Down syndrome. But the key here, and I think this is important in the United States, is that it's because of the mother's distress. And the only person who can measure the mother's distress is the mother. And so for one mother, it might be great distress. And, for example, in Haredi communities, there's studies that show that when they have children with special needs, they think of it as an opportunity. Some of them think of it as an opportunity from God to serve God better because they have to devote time and effort. So for some mothers, that might not be great distress. But if it is great distress to the mother, then it is allowed. But he doesn't mandate it because it's great distress. It's the mother's choice whether it rises to the level of great distress for her. Similarly, for example, if the child is a product of rape or is a mamzer, the psychological distress that also, and also situations, so Rav Moshe Feinstein's point was only if there's pretty certain risk of death to the mother can abortion be done. Rav Waldenberg said that, if there's significant risk of medical problems, so, they don't think that she's going to die, but she's going to have kidney disease or diabetes or something like that. Those are situations where abortion is allowed. But it's really, it starts with the mother and what is she feeling, how is she addressing whatever the situation is going to be, and that's where it starts. I guess this one's mine too. So the question is, when is it murder? And so the idea is that, when is it not murder? So the idea is that if either the head or the majority of the fetus is already out of the birth canal, then it's considered a separate life. So now it's a life, just like the mother is a life. And so at this point, there's no distinction. The mother's life is not prioritized over the baby's because the baby now is considered to have independent life. Prior to that, Rav Moshe Feinstein would still classify it as murder, but there's no murder punishment attached to it, but it's still considered murder, whereas Rav Waldenberg and everyone who thinks like him would say it's not murder, it's a different sort of prohibition.
It's a different sort of what?
Prohibition. For example, it's the prohibition of not injuring yourself or prohibition against other things, yeah.
Yeah, and just to add to that, from my research, and in the short film that I did, Under God, I interviewed Rabbi Weider, who's at YU, and Rav Moshe Feinstein's position is a minority viewpoint. So it's important to know that it's not a popular opinion. It is there, so we need to mention it, but it's not like a majority opinion. And anyone that I've spoken to has said that it's really, as Noam has said, up to the mother in terms of like psychological distress. And on a hopeful note, I have a son who's in high school in a Maran Orthodox school, and coincidentally, in his halacha class, he's learning about abortion, which I was very happy to hear. And he said that overall, he's learning that it's permissible, that it's something that is allowed under Jewish law. So that's being taught at like a very mainstream Orthodox high school. So it's good to know.
What kind of risks does it cause at a time when we need to be all of them? Like I can't express enough how much I think the last 2 years have sucked the life, the energy, the resilience out of so many of us who do the work, and the work wasn't looking so great before October 7th. I mean, I feel like it's a bit of a joke that in our work, I feel like every email begins with, the stakes have never been higher, the need has never been greater, and I keep thinking like, well, eventually we're gonna hit the highest stakes and the greatest need, but apparently we're not. It just keeps getting worse. And so there is a part of me that is incredibly frustrated and disappointed that it was like, we don't have the luxury of taking our eye off this goal. We are under attack like never before when it comes to protecting reproductive rights in this country. We don't have the luxury of talking about anything else. So I think that's part of it. I think that there's a lot of people in this work, Jewish folks in this work, who have found each other after October 7th. And we have found community, and we have found support, and we have found people who understand the challenges that we're facing and can give us that talking point or give us that reference or just hear it. And that is one of the things that I think allows a lot of us to keep coming back and doing this work, is we feel like we have people who are in it with us.
Sure. I mean, just to agree with all of it, the stakes have never been higher, and anti-Semitism is at levels like not seen in a very long time, particularly in the United States. And so we're also seeing that people are completely disenfranchised politically at a time where our country is so divided. And so it's key, we need to find the ways that people can engage comfortably, and we need to find the ways that get people excited. We need to think about what are the things that are going to get them motivated, how do they find those networks that they feel comfortable being in, how do they build those relationships, and we have to. Our bodily autonomy and our rights are at stake. That's a great question. JOFA is one of our top partners. We also work with Uri Litzedek. It's an Orthodox social justice organization, but we would love for more collaborations and more opportunities to partner.
And I think your question is there more engagement on this issue from the Orthodox community? And I think part of the reason, why JOFA is so incredible, because this is such an important space that is needed, is there's a lot of misinformation and lack of education on what abortion is, and there's such a stigma that we're not engaging with it because people aren't talking about it, right? People don't really understand what happens when someone has an abortion, or what happens when someone has a miscarriage. And obviously the Orthodox community, people have a lot of children, so these are things that are very common. This isn't something, abortion, I'm sure, I don't know the exact statistics, but they're very high, I'm sure, in the Orthodox community. And the problem, before October 7th, obviously, is that nobody would talk about it unless it was in a hushed voice or it was shameful in some way. So I think, to all your points, we need to still continue to destigmatize this and talk about it, because yes, there's anti-Semitism, but we're still having children and becoming pregnant, and that's going to still happen at the same time, right? The question was because the Jewish community as a whole has moved towards the right. I think before October 7th it was happening, but now definitely, and has that affected the Orthodox community's attitudes towards abortion? And so that was an amazing question, and I think absolutely. And you mentioned this in the beginning of just, Moshe Feinstein, even decades ago, for whatever reason, started parroting Christian theology or Christian viewpoints on abortion, which doesn't make sense, but he did. And I think that's definitely has been happening within the Orthodox community specifically before October 7th, and now even more so. And it's really a hard position to be in when the viewpoint, I think, and this is not necessarily my viewpoint, but I think the mainstream viewpoint is that the Trump administration, is better for Jewish people, and that's a whole other conversation, but again, that's just the viewpoint, not my viewpoint. So when you have that, they're going to overlook other policies that are happening, and already when the conversation is stigmatized, I think that makes it even harder. But I would love, I don't know, either of you.
Sure. I can't, it's a great question. It's like, honestly, it's such a smart, thoughtful question, and I'm going to need some more time to think about it. But one of the things that came up for me as you were talking about it is, I am sure you are right. I am sure there is some of that happening. And I have always been amazed at the mental gymnastics and machinations that people can do when it comes to things that impact their life directly, specifically abortion. So if you talk to most abortion providers, they will tell you a story about someone who is outside of their clinic every single weekend protesting with signs saying not, blah, 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 blah. And then 1 week, that person is in their clinic, either themselves, with their child, and it's always well, let me explain to you why it's different in this situation. I mean, I don't want to speak for all abortion providers, but most of the ones I know have a story like that. And they can tell you exactly which person it is. Oh, it was Bob. He was out here every weekend with his child until Bob's child sat on the table and was here to see me. And I'm wondering if that, if we are all guilty, right, of doing the mental gymnastics we need to do when it's convenient for us to do them. And if that could be something we'll see changing as time goes by.
It's a great question, and I can't speak to it directly, though I'm sure you are right. But one of the things that really concerns me is the way, and it's not just, and I'm not speaking about the Trump administration, but thinking about the right is legislating Christian values under the guise of religious freedom. And what they mean is Christian nationalism. It is not religious freedom for everybody. It is religious freedom for those with a minority extremist Christian view. And this goes to limitations on reproductive health access, bodily autonomy. It goes to religion in the schools. We are fighting in several states to stop the 10 Commandments from being posted in classrooms. They're putting religious chaplains in public schools, and there's a variety of ways in which they're legislating Christianity as law. And so when we think about a Jewish movement around abortion access, and I think about, in many ways, that the administration has been good on anti-Semitism, we also need to think, what does that mean for our country? What does that mean for our religious freedom? And so that's one of the things that we're talking about broadly, is how do we tie all those things together, because they are tied together.
So I think the right wing in the Orthodox community has found resonance with the right wing politically, and they interact with each other. And I find I probably spend a little too much time with online discussion groups, or used to at least. My wife is nodding. Yes, Rabbi. So most people who would support a lot of what the administration is doing are against having this conference and other women's rights things, including being more restrictive on abortion. To your point, I was talking to someone in Israel, and he said, yes, the Haredi and very right-wing communities, when they talk or write articles, they're very restrictive, but then when individual cases happen, all of a sudden they're big supporters of the less restrictive position. And so I think, and Rabbi Fox was telling me that Rabbi Melamed, who was great posek, who was visiting the United States, was telling him that he is actually moving his approach more towards the less restrictive position because he's seeing the results of being more restrictive. So I think there is, unfortunately, common ground between the right wing in our community and the right wing in our culture, and that's things to work on.
It's a great question.
I want to jump on that one, if I may. There's so much that you can do, and most of it starts with working within your own sphere of influence. We have congregational partners, synagogues across the country who either the rabbi or the president of the temple or whoever is the decider of the thing signs on and says, we stand behind what you're doing. There is absolutely an absence of Orthodox congregations on that page. I would love to see some up there. It comes best, though, when it comes from within the congregation. It doesn't matter which Reform, Conservative, Reconstructionist, Orthodox, you name it, when it is the congregant asking the leadership for it, it is always more successful. So I would encourage you, I brought some materials over there. I would encourage everyone in here to grab them, to take a look. We make it really, really easy to give your synagogue leadership some language about becoming a partner with the Red Tent, and ditto for leadership opportunities. We work really hard to try to identify those, but we also need people to raise their hand and step forward and say, this is the part of our community that I represent, and their voice should be at the table. So it's all of the above.
Exactly. And to add to that, I think also, as we know, because we're sitting here today, most 95 or more % of the leadership in the Orthodox community is male. And I do think, there's a lack of awareness, education, understanding of abortion, of miscarriages. I think if the community understood, these rabbis understood what abortion care is, how many women in their community need this care to complete a miscarriage, they would think twice about it. I spoke to a rabbi early on, right after Dobbs, and they were convinced that if a mother's life is at risk, these hospitals will act. So we now know that that's a fiction, because they're not going to risk it, and women have actually died. So they need to see that. They need to see the stories of women in Texas who died. They need to be aware of it. And I think also in New York, New Jersey, where there's large Orthodox populations, those states happen to be blue states, and you're not seeing those stories as much as you are in red states where there aren't as many Orthodox Jews. So I think there's a lack of awareness and proximity to the dire consequences of it, and we need to be having these conversations directly with them. I think last question.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say one of the best things you can do is around education and normalization. The more that we talk about it, and this is the theme throughout this entire session, is the more that we talk about it, the more clergy talk about it, the more we talk about it in our communities, the less stigma there will be. We at NCJW have rabbis and Jewish clergy for repro, where we teach them and talk to them about how to talk about abortion and reproductive health access, and that's really an important part of our role. I also just want to say, as far as bringing the Orthodox community more along, we sit at the table of the Conference of Presidents of Major Jewish Organizations, which includes the Orthodox Union, and have been engaged with the Orthodox Union on very many policy priorities, and continue to dialogue with their leadership around which items can we work on together. And so that's an ongoing conversation. But as Ali said, much of it does come from the ground up as far as your individual clergy and synagogues. One thing I just wanted to share is that there's increasing threats of criminalization of clergy who are providing counsel to congregants about reproductive health access, depending on what the legal situation is in your state. Clergy could be penalized for having a conversation with somebody about what their options may be. And NCJW actually this week is launching a 50-state clergy privilege guide for clergy of all faiths, to talk about what are privileged conversations, what can clergy do or not do, when can they not have to share what they're talking about with their congregants in a legal case, in case of prosecution. And so we've been working on this for 3 years. We're really excited to finally have this resource. It will be password protected on our website. We're very concerned about confidentiality. We're launching it with a webinar on Wednesday, but that is something that if you want to go home to your clergy and talk about your rabbis, in Maharats, how are we going to support communities and keep talking about this? This is a useful guide, and I'd be happy to talk to any of you after this and share the information, but that's a way that we can keep talking about this and support our communities.
Thank you. That is a great action item, and so I think we're out of time. But if any, Noam, Ali, if you want to have any closing action items, words. Nope. All right. Well, thank you, the three of you. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.